you have to have visionaries. You know, you have to have people that will think outside of the norm.
We're getting access to viewpoints and to people and to connection that we never, ever would have.
Having integrity in yourself and in your work, that is success.
You have to believe change is possible.
We are our own leaders, and that we all are responsible for the change that we want to see.
Part of what we have to do is think, how do we intentionally rebuild a sense of community?
A broader question of representation and who gets to create the images that travel the world and define how we see the world.
Every single person around the world can create a movement.
My name is Bhumika Tharoor. I'm managing editor at The Atlantic, and I'm excited to welcome you to The Big Story, a conversation with National Climate Advisor Ali Zaidi. I'm going to give a quick intro, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. Each year, the planet's climate crisis feels more acute. Scientists warn of a planetary tipping point. Activists demand action. White House National Climate Advisor Ali Zaidi joined me today for a conversation to help us think through this moment. We'll discuss some of the major green policy initiatives of this administration, the complexities and opportunities surrounding climate action, and the long road ahead as we work together to build the nation's infrastructure, scale up new critical technologies, and lead in a global energy transition. A bit of housekeeping before we jump in. Please silence your cell phones, but keep them close. If you see or hear anything today that captures your attention, we encourage you to share on your social network using the hashtag TAF23. And thanks for joining us. Let's just jump right in.
Yeah.
So, Ali, this administration has set a national target to cut emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. So here's a two-part question to kick things off. First, how do this administration's legislative wins with the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and bipartisan infrastructure law position us to achieve this goal? And secondly, we just heard the GOP candidates last night vowing to scrap as much of the Biden agenda as possible and unshackle U.S. fossil fuels. So how much of your long-term vision is contingent on Biden winning a second term?
Wow. Well, first of all, great to be here with you and in conversation. I think it's helpful to understand where we were going in terms of evaluating cause and effect and the implications of policy preference. It's really easy right now, standing where we stand, to think so much of this just happens by accident, right? The market just moves us in a direction, technology curves just go coincidentally in the right direction and move us towards a cleaner energy future. Just 2.5 years ago, the projections for 2030 for the United States were that we would have reduced our emissions maybe 20, 21, 22% by 2030. In that context, 2020, 21, 22, the president set a goal to reduce emissions by 50 to 52%, which means more than doubling the pace of decarbonization in this decisive decade. And the legislative efforts that you talked about, and, you know, folks know IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Most folks know Bill, the infrastructure law. Folks don't know is we also passed the first environmental treaty through the United States Senate on a bipartisan basis in decades, the Kigali Amendment. That in and of itself is worth probably a percentage point in that math to get to 50. But combined, those pieces of legislation, as well as some of the efforts we have underway, now put us on the trajectory to be able to get there. But this is a policy-sensitive enterprise. What we prioritize as a public coming together in the democratic process is very relevant to this. Had we not passed the Inflation Reduction Act, we would be a gigaton short relative to where we are today, which is to say potentially below 40% on the trajectory, if you sort of work back from 50. So there's a massive difference, and the agenda, I think, that's being advanced by folks who, I don't know if they don't believe in climate change, I don't know if they don't want to support U.S. Domestic manufacturing. And just to be clear, I'm not commenting and won't on the political campaign, but what I do see here in the discourse in Washington is we had a debt ceiling conversation where we were threatening the full faith and credit of the United States, and on the other side, the table stakes were, will you repeal the Inflation Reduction Act? Will you pull back hundreds of factories worth of investment in the United States? And again, we're hurtling towards government shutdown, which not only has impact for the clean energy economy where we go forward, but to 2,000, there are 2,000 recovery projects that FEMA is undertaking right now that would get stalled out if we slam on the brakes. So, for me, and I think for the American people, you don't have to open the IPCC and flip through a science manual to know we're in a crisis. The crisis is here, it's live, and it's clear in our communities, and so is the economic upside. So our job is to make the case, our job is to connect the dots, our job is to create the enabling policy environment, and we're going to stay focused on doing that.
Right. And well, speaking of crisis, last week, California Governor Newsom went to the UN and said the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. Does it make sense for the Biden administration to continue allowing the development of fossil fuel infrastructure? And I say this having just read the Wall Street Journal expose about Exxon having silently and strategically investing in resources to downplay climate change itself. I'm just curious, how do you respond to critics who feel that the U.S. policy is still too tethered to these big traditional energy companies?
The question is a good one, and I think if we're going to be effective at advancing the most powerful solutions, we have to be clear-eyed about the challenge. The root cause of climate change, whether it's the skies turning orange, whether it's the wildfire smoke we're breathing in, whether it's the coastlines that have become a greater vector of risk. I see Raj Punjabi here, whether it's the massive stress we're putting on our public health system and the impacts that we're seeing cascade, whether through pandemics or through destabilization of governments around the world, that connects back to increasing atmospheric concentration of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And the only way for us to address the challenge is to attack the root cause of the problem for good, is to attack the root cause of the problem. So we need to either find alternatives to using fossil fuels, or we need to develop fossil fuels in a way that we're capturing the emissions and sequestering them. The engineering of all of this makes it so that capturing emissions is a challenging task. Sequestering it is a challenging task. This administration's put a lot of emphasis on that. But the good news is we have all of these alternatives now. We are on a path now to triple the pace at which we're deploying solar and wind post the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. We've doubled the number of EV chargers. We've tripled the deployment pace there. So we've got to go way faster on all of those. And in terms of, and I want to be very direct in answering, I think, the second part of the question. In terms of fossil fuels, we have, as an administration, for the first time, really integrated considerations around climate into how infrastructure is developed. We are now doing climate analysis that was not done before. We are integrating it into the way we procure as a government. We're integrating it into the way we manage lands. And the change has not happened overnight, and it won't, because we have to be again, clear-eyed about the reality that there are hundreds of millions of vehicles on our roads that today are running on gasoline. Now, so we've got to manage this transition. We got to do it effectively and aggressively, and that will mean a reduction in our dependence on fossil fuels that will phase in over a period of time. And that is an important part of the solution, just as it is an important part of the solution to ramp up deployment of clean energy and invest in reducing the cost of those. So we got to do both, and I think as an administration, we are focused on doing that.
Great. President Biden was on the picket line this week with the United Auto Workers supporting their strike. But there's something of a clash between the support for these workers and the UAW's stated concerns about the mandates to turbocharge the production of electric vehicles, which would then require fewer workers to assemble. Do you see do you see a tension there, and how do you reconcile that?
So let's start with where the president has been, not just at the picket line, but speaking very clearly about the need for record profits to be reflected in record contracts. The need for this not just to be a moment where we expand our ability to produce clean energy technologies, but also use it as an opportunity to get more people on the road to jobs that can support a family. It's time not just to put steel on the ground to build out these factories, but steel in the spine of the American middle class, which has been disinvested in over decades. I think there is a desire to portray a conflict between the direction where we are headed and workers. But I think when you talk to a lot of folks, including people in the labor movement, what you'll hear is this. And EPI, which Economic Policy Institute, did analysis working with unions on the analysis, by the way, that shows if we do this transition right, we can actually grow the number of auto jobs in the United States. And if you look at what's been happening over the last 2.5 years, instead of shutting down plants, we're creating new ones. We've got 15 gigafactories for batteries being built in the United States after an administration that really just sort of thrown the ball over to China to dominate this sector. So for the first time, we're seeing an industrial renaissance in the United States. The big question that these firms have to answer is, are they going to pursue this expansion with neutrality? Are they going to pursue this expansion in a way that leverages one of our core strengths as a country, which is this highly skilled unionized workforce? And the president's been very clear where he stands on that. But I don't think that is at odds with dominating the next chapter of the auto revolution, and that's very clear where that's going. And you look at places that have gone slow. There's a natural experiment, right, between what the United States has been doing, what's happening in Europe. There's massive uptake of vehicles that are being produced in China that are entering the European market and dominating. In the U.S.-made electric vehicles are dominating, and that's the way we want it to be. So I think we've got to be in this conversation with workers at the table. We've got to have their back because they've had ours. And I think we've got to, at least the way we focus on this is to focus more on the facts and less on a narrative, which I think is misleading.
Okay, I'm glad that you brought up the European context. I'm going to get more into that in a bit. But on that note, can you give us a sense of what an American workforce looks like that is in an economy fully shaped by the IRA? I've been following some of your work in the American Climate Corps.
Yeah, we're really excited about this. One of the things that dropped out of the Inflation Reduction Act as it moved through what was a long and winding road path to enactment was this idea that we would create a low barrier to entry pathway for a more diverse set of Americans, young people entering what is going to be a booming sector. So last week we launched the American Climate Corps using existing resources, existing authorities, 6 agencies involved, 10 states already signed up, private sector, philanthropy stepping up to play their role. And what this will do in our first recruitment class alone, 20,000 people is our target, it will create for people from all walks of life. This won't look, it is inspired by, but it will not look like FDR's core. This will be a diverse set of Americans who now have a pathway into a clean energy workforce that we desperately need. So we're excited about the Climate Corps. This is really kind of neat for a wonk person like me. The U.S. tax code, for the first time, stipulates the tax credits that you get for business investment into clean energy on whether you're paying a prevailing wage and whether 10% of your labor hours are from apprenticeships. So you think about, and it's not like you get 5% more tax credit if you do that. You get 5x more tax credit if you do that. So this is a massive incentive. And so not only are we creating this pipeline through the American Climate Corps, on the demand side, we've made the tax code do the work of coding into the way this industry grows to have it be high wage and have it source workers through these union-based programs, these apprenticeship programs. So we are, I think, staring at the beginning of a very exciting story for American rebirth renaissance in terms of worker power, manufacturing here in the United States, and creating pathways to the middle class.
Great. There's something else I'd like to get on the table here, and it's about the fashion industry, and my colleagues have covered this extensively. Virtually every stage of the fashion industry, specifically fast fashion, is incredibly wasteful, from design, manufacturing, delivery, even recycling. The fashion industry is responsible for 10% of annual global emissions, more than all international flights and shipping combined. It's estimated that the industry's emissions will surge more than 50% by 2030, which is 7 years from now. Why isn't this industry regulated or pressured like some of the other big sectors? Mm-hmm. And what needs to happen to shift the focus onto this sector?
So this is not public, but we are working really hard internally to develop a coherent approach to bring this sector together around a coordinated trajectory to decarbonize. And one of the, I think, exciting things is that our toolbox seems to be growing in terms of decarbonizing. Number one, I think the circularity in the fashion industry, there are increasing circularity plays that are going on, whether it's through reuse or refit and through resale. And the market there is, I think, being inventive and growing. So we're excited to figure out how, as an administration, we could potentially play there and boost circularity plays in this space. The second is on the input materials and the industrial processes associated with that. Through our work on industrial decarbonization, one of the things we're really trying to be inventive about and aggressive on is how you get materials to be cleaner. Now, oftentimes when I talk about materials, I talk about steel and cement and aluminum and flat glass. Those are the biggest. If cement were a country, it would be in the G20 in terms of emissions, right? So it's a massive honking prize. We're trying to do aggressive decarb, not just in buildings materials, but in materials for fabrics as well. And our national labs, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, chief among them, are chasing after these low-cost and low GHG emission materials. Our EPA is focused on how do you get the private sector to do the alternatives analysis. So that's a second place, I think, where we're focused. The third thing, and I'll stop here because then I will have fully rolled out a strategy that is completely internal right now. Don't tell anybody. But the third thing that we're focused on, and this is a broader play in the industrial sector, is to think through, as Europeans are, think through not only how do we build measurement of the embodied carbon, right, to understand, how much embodied carbon is in a car or in a building or in a pair of jeans, but also to figure out how we stop treating products the same when they ship, especially across borders. Because one of the things that I think when you talk to manufacturers in the United States, they say, of these products, they say, well, you know, I want to invest in this, but I don't want to get dumped on with dirty products and there not to be differentiation in the marketplace or transparency in the marketplace. So we're pursuing a very aggressive effort funded by the Inflation Reduction Act at the EPA to boost the transparency and measurement of embodied carbon in a variety of products. So stay tuned. This is a thing that I think, as you noted, we recognize as a significant opportunity set. We see massive demand. The private sector, I think, has invented more tools. And now we need to figure out how to scale that up.
Across the country, people are seeing rises in insurance premiums, and alarmingly, some can't even get property insurance in certain coastal cities. We're also seeing that these disasters are more devastating and increasingly costly. So I'm curious, is the United States doing enough to prepare people for the financial burden of climate change?
Well, we have to do more. That's absolutely right. And today, actually, later today, at the White House, we're hosting 70 state, local, and tribal leaders for the first ever White House Resilience Summit focused on what we do in terms of resilience relative to a changing climate. We're issuing the first ever national framework on climate resilience. And what this is designed to do, we were able to secure, thanks to the president's leadership, over $50 billion into resilience funding through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. What we need to do now is to build the policy ecosystem to get the maximum impact out of that, to get the implementation partners aligned to get the maximum impact out of that. And what that means, just to be a little bit more specific than you maybe are used to from someone in Washington, is we've got to get granular and actually design and pass building codes. So we launched this building codes initiative because we know, for example, for hurricanes, we know there are building codes that keep the roof from blowing off. You just bolt and brace, right? We know, fire-wise, it's a standard that if you're in the wildland-urban interface, there are actually fire risk reducing materials that you can use in your buildings that will help reduce that risk. We know if you're in the floodplain, you should build a certain amount higher, and that will reduce the risk. And we're trying to get that scaled up through building codes around the country. Louisiana is an example where the industry teamed up with both Democrats and Republicans and passed through the legislature new building codes for the first time in a long time that does just this. So it's solutions like this that we need to ramp up alongside a massive investment. And we've got to do it in an equity-centered way, in a people-centered way. There is no national solution to resilience, community-based, community-driven, and we're going to do it.
Is this something that you take, well, okay.
All right.
Is it something that you analyze? You talked about there's no current national solution, but is it something that you're looking at from specific geographic locations within the country to start? And how do you triage where to focus?
Yeah, so one, there's the data part of this. So the National Climate Assessment is coming out, the next one in just a few weeks. That contributes more and more data to our understanding of the risk. The second is downscaling those risk assessments into usable tools. We launched a tool called Camera with the National Oceanic Administration that helps downscale that data and make it usable for decision makers on the ground. We know that the threat is going to look different for different communities, which is why part of our funding is responsive to community-driven plans, right? We've got a BRIC program at FEMA where you apply based on your understanding of the risk and how you want to solve it. And then finally, I think we've got to make sure that people are getting directly understanding and access, and that's part of the awareness building effort, and things like the American Climate Corps will also help with it.
Great. We've seen success in Western emissions. They're dropping. But realistically, how much can the West do to fundamentally change the global equation around climate change when countries like India and China might be the most essential factors here?
It's a really interesting question about theory of change. And the theory of change here is, through the Paris Agreement, we set up a mechanism that allows countries to, on their own, determine their contribution for how we're going to achieve 1.5 degrees. And it builds transparency, and then it builds rationing. This year, when we go to the climate conference, will be the first global stock take since this was launched. And it will find that we're way off track as a world. And if we showed up to that, the United States, who's supposed to be the leader and is one of the biggest emitters in the world, if we showed up to that and we were nowhere, what would that do for everybody else? So I think our theory of change is demand transparency, set clear standards, lead by the power of our example, drive down the cost of decarbonization. The IRA is not only going to lower costs for clean energy here, but everywhere else. For every ton of emissions we reduce here, we're projected to reduce 2 or 3 tons around the world just because we're helping de-risk the scale up of this technology. And then we've got to demand countries like China step up and take bold action consistent with the science, because we're all in this shit together, and the only way we get through it is together. So we've got to do our part, but yes, we got to bring everybody along. That's not the scientific term for climate change.
This week, former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown proposed a 3% windfall tax on the oil and gas exports of revenues of the biggest producing countries. He believes that this could generate $25 billion a year that would go to poor countries to fight climate change. Would you support an initiative like this?
This administration has set a target of quadrupling adaptation aid globally. We have set a target of $11 billion for international climate finance. This year, we deposited $1 billion into the Green Climate Fund, $500 million to catalyze a bunch of other nations to help protect and save the Amazon. We have a economic responsibility, we have a security responsibility, and we have a moral responsibility to lift countries up into the solutions that will help us meet this moment, both in terms of clean energy and in terms of adaptation. So whatever the source of revenues are, whatever the mechanism is, whether it's leveraged through the World Bank or delivered on a grant basis, we have to collectively do a lot more. And I think President Biden is very focused on how we build the political consensus here in the United States to be as strong of a partner in that conversation overseas.
And if the U.S. hasn't hit that $11.4 billion a year in climate finance, can we expect poorer countries to act without this money?
You know, I think we shouldn't presuppose that we're not going to hit it, and regardless of whether folks hit their marks or not, we should be hitting ours. The Paris Climate Agreement was a compact of trust, right? And when you have a relationship of trust on a global challenge that requires urgency, you're not constantly looking right and left to see if you should keep running in the right direction. You run really hard, and you make it so that folks can trust you and you trust them, and everybody feels a sense of momentum going in the right direction. That's what we got to do. And so we're pursuing it all the time.
One final pivot here, something I've been looking just to get a clearer sense on. There's been some skepticism about how effective carbon offsets are actually, and whether it makes more sense to spend and to kind of aggressively pursue research and investment in carbon capture instead. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I worked in the Obama years, and during that time when we went to the Paris Climate Conference, got this big agreement, the U.S. goal for reducing emissions by the middle of this century was around 85%. Now our goal is net zero. And the reason I point that out is because the state of the art, our wildest imagination just a decade ago, was that there were going to be corners of this economy that were just too hard to decarbonize. Whether we looked at the industrial sector, steel, cement, aluminum, we looked at large commercial buildings, and we thought, gee, that's just going to be too hard. Aviation, just going to be too hard. What we've seen in the last decade is the inventive spirit of folks who are focused on these challenges, work being done in our labs and in our universities, risk being taken by entrepreneurs and large-scale capital, and now we have pathways to decarbonize everything. So that then raises the question, well, what is the role of offsets? First of all, there is a role, especially in the near term, but whatever that role is, we have to have confidence of what it means, what science and measurement and monitoring and verification is going on. This administration has invested a great deal, hundreds of millions of dollars, to set up measurement, monitoring, verification regimes, for example, in the nature-based space. So there is a role. It's a near-term role in large part. It's an opportunity, I think, to invest in other parts of the economy and help them scale up solutions, right? So we should think about what can we do. For example, I'll give you a very concrete example. The Tongass National Forest in Alaska. It is the lungs of North America. And we've taken action in this administration to protect that, working in partnership with the indigenous people that have lived there for thousands of years. They are now able to tap into a mandatory offset market in California and get compensated for protecting old growth trees as opposed to cutting them down. So to me, when you say, well, do offsets have a role? Yeah, I think they do. For folks who've now made a decision to protect land that they could have used for revenue, how do we help compensate them? How do we help meet them where they are? The role, I don't think, is for anyone to slow walk on the path that they can pursue to decarbonize. And today, where we stand, everybody has a trajectory that they should be moving down. Every single industry, every single sector, everyone should be taking those steps. And in the meantime, they should be helping others make that journey as well. So I think there's a role for the government to play on MMRV. There's a role to play to demand transparency. This cannot be a haven for greenwashing, and it cannot be an excuse for going any slower than we are right now, because the only speed we should be going is faster.
I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. This was incredibly insightful.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We have more lined up for you today. Next up in this venue, please join us for The Big Story, The Future of American Conservatism at 12:30. And tonight at 7 p.m., you won't want to miss our exclusive screening of the upcoming Netflix docuseries, Big Vape, The Rise and Fall of Juul, followed by a conversation about the making of the series. And finally, if you're interested in exploring more of The Atlantic, we ask that you support our journalism by becoming a subscriber. Visit theatlantic.com, and you can see options there. And if you're already a subscriber, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.